Thanks for inviting me up, and thanks for coming. It's great. I think it's important to start with the story. So, I think it must have been in the late 1960s. There's a man called Dick Harry. You've probably never heard of him. He was at that time was working as a ranger in a nature reserve in the Highlands of Scotland, a place called Craigmeggy, which is a very beautiful mountain. And one day he was told that there was a man coming from the Highlands and Islands Development Board who was going to, who wanted to have a look at the area with an idea of developing a hotel complex next to this mountain. And he turned up, drove up in his car, his suit, his briefcase, and Dick didn't really know what to expect, and he didn't really know what to do. So he thought, well, I'll just do what I always do. I'll take him for a walk and show him around. So he did. And they walked up the valley, and as they were walking up, Dick noticed really high up there was a golden eagle. And he pointed to the eagle, and he told the guy there was this eagle there. And the guy's there in his suit, looking quite uncomfortable. Anyway, I was thinking, and was talking a little bit about the project, and it was going to be a huge development. And it was at that time in the Highlands where these big development projects were kind of just planted, and no one really got much of a say about it. It was called inward investment. And after a while they stopped and sat down. And when they sat down, they sat there for a while quite quietly, and suddenly this golden eagle came down and sat on a rock right next to them. I don't know if you've ever seen a golden eagle, but they're like that high, and they have this huge 6-foot wingspan. Beautiful bird. And nothing was said, and the conversation kind of disappeared. And this man became very quiet. And they sat there for a while, and the bird went, and they walked back to the car park. And when they got back to the car park, it was time to say goodbye, and they shook hands, and the guy in the suit said to Dick, "Whatever you do, don't let anybody build or develop anything here." He got in his car and he left. And nothing ever happened there. You still go there, there's a car park, and that's it. What happened to him? What happened to that man? A man who came wearing a cloak of industrialism, with a whole worldview behind him, a whole culture, hundreds and hundreds of years of post-enlightenment thinking, and walks into that environment, and within the space of an hour or two, has completely turned his whole view around. What happened to him? We'll come back to him in a bit, that story. So I thought I might start by just introducing myself a little bit, just to find a bit of context. So I've written some notes. It's really difficult introducing yourself, I think, which feels slightly odd. So my background, originally, my first degree was in the arts, and I trained as a designer. And quite a few years ago now, I got into teaching design, and I really loved education. I really loved teaching, and that was in a tertiary context. And my first job was teaching on a degree program in New Zealand, and where I lived for a number of years. And it was wonderful. I loved the process of teaching, but I wasn't really into teaching design. And it was very focused on consumer culture and on classical economics, I guess. And it always felt a bit incongruent to me. But I learnt a lot about teaching, and I also learnt that I loved it. So after a while, I decided to go and see if I could get the opportunity to teach something I did love, which is mountaineering and rock climbing. And I went off to the National Outdoor Training Centre in New Zealand and did a course there to learn how to become an outdoor instructor. And during that course, a job opportunity came up at the centre, and I applied for it and I got it. So I ended up, I went there for 10 weeks and I stayed for 4 years. And so that's really what I became an outdoor educator. And my job there was working with 14 to 18-year-olds on youth programs, and also working with adults. Some of that was about teaching mountaineering and rock climbing, but some of it was about working with management teams, looking at leadership and various other, management development issues. And I found that work was really interesting, working with people who were working mostly in the private sector, adults, coming along from that world and having these experiences outdoors. And across all these different groups I was working with, I noticed that these incredible changes happened just by taking people out. And the courses were usually no more than a week long, but there would be these fundamental changes. And I found out that these changes were often the person who was leading the group would have a huge influence over the direction of the change. So this started to think a lot about this. What is it about these places that kind of makes change possible? And what is it about the way it's facilitated that helps decide what the direction of change is? So I did that for a bit. And I got to experiment. Eventually I got asked to design a program that was to train outdoor leaders to deliver education for sustainability. And it was a dream for me, really, because by this time I was a passionate environmentalist, and suddenly I could bring my love of the outdoors, environmentalism and learning and education together into a role. So we developed this program, and it had no content. We had no paper, there was no PowerPoints, we didn't do anything. Whenever we had to draw or write something, we usually did it with a stick, found a bit of sand somewhere and drew a picture or something like that. And what we focused on was giving people these really immense experiences outdoors, and then asking them to share what that experience was for them. Working as a group, seeing how it felt, and trying to make a move away from a very rational thinking mind, which is to say it was countercultural, because we don't really, I think education is a lot about this rational thinking mind. Eventually, having experimented on all these groups for a number of years, doing everything I could think of, reading poetry in the woodland, in the woods, and borrowing all kinds of activities from anywhere I could find, and trying them out and seeing what happened. Eventually a program kind of emerged, and it seemed to work really well. But I started then to get a bit frustrated because I didn't know what was happening to people. I didn't understand what the process was. So eventually I came back to the UK and did a master's in human ecology at the Centre for Human Ecology in Edinburgh at the time. And I came to that course because there was a module on eco-psychology, which was this new subject that just kind of emerged, really. And it was the only one I could find that wasn't in the States, and I couldn't afford to go and study in the States. So we came back to Scotland and I did that course. And I kind of landed. That I realised that there was a whole theoretical framework for what I'd experienced. There were hundreds of people practicing this kind of work, and there were a whole raft of possibilities of how to design programs and run them and everything. So it was like a homecoming for me. Interestingly, I went back to teach that course for 7 years, and one of the people that was on that program was James, who sat over there in the striped shirt. So that's very nice to see him again after a number of years. That course gave me a chance to do some research as well. And the research I did was on the transformative power of wild places to shift people towards more sustainable ways of living. And I found when I got into that research, there was another aspect to that, which was what impact does our industrial Western culture have on us in our attitudes towards nature? So it's a double-edged sword, really. Anyway, so I did that, and I started doing a bit of teaching in that context. In the meantime, I carried on with all my outdoor courses, particularly a course that we used to call ecotherapy, and it was for people who were interested in working therapeutically outdoors. Because by now what I discovered was that what people experienced out there was less education and more healing. It was more to do with therapy. And I'll come back to that in a minute. I ran that course for a number of years. Then someone came on that course that turned out to be the communications officer for WWF Scotland. And she had been developing an idea where she wanted to generate stories of change in Scottish culture within Scotland. And her idea was that if she could get people who had influence, who weren't thought of as being greenies, to talk openly about environmental issues and to describe their own change processes, that it would make that normal, and it would develop a language of change in a community that didn't have a language for change around sustainability. So the problem she had was, though, that she had this idea, but she didn't have anything for the people. She didn't have the people. She didn't have anything for them to write about. She didn't have any. There was no nucleus to the centre of the idea. So she said to me, because she'd had a really big time on her week, on her ecotherapy week, would I design a program where they would get people in positions of power, would flatter them with this being invited to come on this innovative new leadership program, would blind them with the Panda brand, the second most famous brand on earth after Coca-Cola, and the oldest and largest conservation charity. But they could get to people who wouldn't normally be interested in sustainability and kind of draw them in. So they identified 7 people, and they came along on a program that became known as the Natural Change Project. And the program lasted 6 months, involved 3 weeks of wilderness residentials plus mentoring time in between, and it worked really well. It had a really big impact and generated 2,500 photographs and reams of stories that were publicly available, and went on to create some huge change within the different communities of those various different people. Because it worked so well, they commissioned a second project. And the aim of that project was, they decided, now they tested it for themselves, they decided to identify people within education in Scotland specifically. And their goal was really simple. They wanted to influence the development of the new curriculum for excellence in Scotland. They wanted to get sustainability into the heart of that curriculum. So they invited all these people. So they weren't political, and that was important. But they also weren't frontline. They were people who advised the ministers on policy, and they were people who then implemented policy through things like teacher training and developing resources and so on. And they came, and we did a second project. And that project also went very well. And as a result of that project, and it's quite a long story, but as a result of that project, 4 women got together. They wrote to the minister, and set up a steering group, and they managed to get the steering group heard, and they managed to influence the curriculum for excellence. They got sustainability as a core component in that curriculum. It's the only national curriculum in the world with sustainability as a core component. And whilst they were at it, they decided, as outdoor learning was the method that had worked for them, they also managed to get outdoor learning as another core component. Yeah. So that's the one really good causal A to B story in that project. All the other change is much messier, actually much more interesting, but much messier. So that project has consumed my time really for about 6 years now. And there's more to say about that, but that's not the main focus this evening, so I won't say much more. So now my time's split between teaching academically. I run some private, like a distance learning course in ecopsychology, which you do on the internet. I teach at Schumacher College in Devon. I do a bit of research work through the University of Exeter as a fellow there, through their Department of Geography. I'm a co-director of Natural Change Limited. So our job is to deliver future projects, and also, very importantly, to train facilitators to deliver that type of work. And that's how I know Roy, because he came on an intro to facilitating Natural Change Week. It's nice to see another familiar face. So, and the other thing we did with Natural Change as well, we started doing research. We started writing papers and getting them published. And we were particularly interested in methodology, because it struck us that most methodology around researching those kinds of processes missed all the good information, because they focused too much on quantitative data and on positivism, on traditional approaches to evidence. And so we've developed some methodologies that draw from social sciences and from psychology and bring them together, and also from philosophy, and design this methodology. And then we've used that to look at the stories of change, the narratives that have developed through natural change, and have then produced other papers to comment on what might be happening there, and to look at the efficacy of the project. So there's a bit of an academic research angle, and then there's the teaching work, and then the other bit is, of course, working outdoors in various parts of Europe, delivering these programs still. And actually, it is more or less exactly the same program that I was running 17 years ago in New Zealand. So it's very interesting. It's a very simple program. Still hasn't got any content, and still very much about experience and about processing that experience. I live in Cornwall with my daughter and my partner and my lovely dog Ruby. We're about 6 miles from the beach. We spend a lot of time. And before that, I just lived in the north of Scotland for 7 years. So I've got this kind of, I live in Cornwall and work a lot in Scotland, and a slightly strange commuter thing going on. Is that enough? That's probably enough. Good. Okay. Right. Now we're not going to get through all this, and I'm not going to try because I don't want to rush. I thought we'd just do a bit of a kind of rapid fire, just deal with a few of those big questions first. In the blurb, where's the blurb gone? There's a question about who's educating the educators, global capitalist culture, in my opinion. And so the other question is, do we need different ways of approaching the education for sustainability? Yes, we do. And I think I've seen an extraordinary explosion of incredible work in the education sector around sustainability, but it's not enough, and in my opinion, it's not radical enough. It's not courageous enough, and it doesn't use. There's a whole load of stuff available that doesn't get engaged with. And I think that's where we need to go next as educators, I think. But that it's been incredibly important. What's been done already has been an incredibly important part of the process, and there shouldn't be any disrespect put on it. I think it's been working, it's been doing its thing and evolving. So I just wanted to hit those two questions to start with, just to get them out of the way. The next question really is, what is education? What is it? I mean, we could probably spend the next week discussing that, but what is education? Any thoughts? What do you think? What is it? Sorry?
Facilitating learning.
Facilitating learning, yeah. That's a kind of a processy approach, yeah.
Formal education in maybe our societal context is maybe about getting jobs or passing exams or that type of thing.
Yeah.
That's the way it's conveyed in terms of achievement.
Yeah. So using the term formal education, yeah, to describe the kind of the state-managed system, as it were. Yeah, whether it's privately or publicly delivered. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it a society, the older generation's way of passing on the skills that they think the next generation will need? Usually it's their skills.
Yeah. So like
writing, maths, we think you're going to need this. So it's the way the whole society knowledge transfers to generations.
So like an intergenerational aspect, a passing on of important skills.
Yeah, what they think they're going to need.
Yeah.
What they needed.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts, just kind of quickly?
Perhaps passing on lots of stuff, but not passing on new ways of thinking.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So, sorry. Go on. Yeah.
Just learning. I think education doesn't have to necessarily be something someone teaches you, or something you learn yourself.
Yes. Okay. Lovely. Right. That's enough. That's a perfect set of stuff. So, I mean, I think what I wanted to say about it was that, the root of the word from Latin is about bringing forth. There's this idea of bringing forth. And what that says to me straight away is that it comes from within. There's something that needs to come from within. It's about allowing something to emerge from the learner. And then I suddenly started to think about training. What's training? And we talked about training and so on. And training, of course, is where it feels to me where something comes in from outside, and we need training. We need to learn how to do maths, and we need to, in our culture today, we need to learn how to, use Microsoft Word or whatever it is. There's a purpose for training, for learning those skills. But it strikes me that the training agenda has kind of gone over the top of the education thing altogether, and education in some ways lost its heart. This idea of, not all education of course, but lost its idea in a formal setting of bringing forth of something, allowing people to become who they really are. So I just wanted to mention that, to get us thinking a little bit about stuff being overlaid onto our lives, and stuff that comes from within us, something that comes from a deeper root perhaps. And then the next question, which is we touched on there, which is what if this is what education is, what's it for? What are we trying to do here? And actually, without even opening that was covered really, because there's stuff about passing on skills, about giving, particularly I think traditionally, children and young people the skills we think they might need going into the future and all that kind of stuff. But the history, the education system in a formal sense, I don't know, you probably know better than me, but my understanding is that it largely came out of industrialism, out of needing to train people to be able to take part in the Industrial Revolution. I remember hearing a story about factory owners educating workers so that they could read the manuals and the safety instructions on machinery. And the other part, of course, is a religious education. And a big push of that was about developing the moral fortitude of people through allowing them to be able to read the Bible, particularly in this country anyway. So education, what's it for? It's got a big agenda, and that agenda is very, very cultural. It's very, largely, I guess, about maintaining or promoting a certain type of culture. So I think that's important as well, that all education is political, in my opinion. So the problem is then, when we've got a problem, a global problem, that is largely created by a particular culture, and the education system is largely dominated by that culture, how do we change that culture? How do we do that? Can we change that system using the same methods, the same thinking, the same approaches, and by promoting the same culture that created the problem in the first place? This is the big question. So, is education largely, as formal education anyway, is it largely about maintaining the status quo? And if we're trying to change the status quo, which I think we probably are in education for sustainability, then is it ever really going to be able to step outside itself and come back with a critical eye? And we've probably all been educated. And I went to university and I did formal education, and that's where I learned to think critically. I am the product of a classic state-based formal education system, and yet, like you, I'm able to be here in this room thinking more critically about it. So it's very complex, and again, it's not about saying one thing is bad or one thing is good, but it's very much, I think, about being aware of where education's come from and where it might start to get limited. So if the education system can create people like us that can challenge it, can it also create people that can change it? Because that's different. Thinking critically and challenging something is different to actually making it change or being part of the change process. So what I'm pushing out there is there might be a need for a bit more of a revolutionary edge. Yes, I've written here, reform or revolution? The big question. Are you with me so far? It's kind of making sense. Good. So the next question, which is I hate this question. What is sustainability? I was at, this sounds dead glamorous, but it doesn't happen a lot. I was in Norway a couple of weeks ago at a conference, and there was a workshop where a load of people, a load of EU folks were developing a white paper on agriculture. And the speaker there just reminded them that when they went off into their work groups that they were going to be using the Brundtland Report definition of sustainability. It was like 1987, was it?
Yes.
And I was thinking, but okay, you can critique it to death, but it's a definition and it's worked quite well. It strikes me though the problem happened, and I remember this. You may or may not remember it, but it was in 1992 at Rio Earth Summit. 92, is that right? Yeah. Claire Short went out to Rio, and when she was out there, she obviously did a load of stuff and came back to the UK, and suddenly sustainability had changed. Suddenly sustainability was now sustainable economic development. So it was really clever, a really brilliant bit of politics to take this this movement that was threatening to really upset everything, and very nicely loop it back into the current dominant classical economic system. And I think since then, I don't know about you, but I've been utterly confused about what sustainability is. And I was having a chat with someone last week who's saying, why don't we start using the word sustenance instead? About how do we sustain life, how do we sustain ourselves and so on. And I quite like that. It does something, I think, that changes the idea of sustainability. Something a bit more wholesome about sustenance. So again, I want to touch on that mostly to not to provide a definition, but to open it out a little bit. I'm hoping very much that this evening you'll go away with more questions than answers. That would be a much better result for me. I haven't got any answers. So then the final bit of that whole thing is, what is education for sustainability? We don't really know what sustainability is. We have our ideas. Are we educating for sustainable economic development? Are we educating to sustain ourselves as healthy, happy human beings? Are we trying to sustain the systems that support us? What's going on there? So it's just to say that it's all quite confusing, I think. So having stirred all that up into a big mess, I'm going to move on. I want to just draw up something about there's Carl Jung. You all heard of him? Yeah? So he had this model that he called the faculties of the ego. I'm just going to scribble it up here. I always draw it the wrong way around, so. Okay, I'm going to draw it the wrong way around. So he's saying we've got these 4 faculties, and they sit kind of opposite each other. Does that make sense? So thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. Has anybody ever done a Myers-Briggs test? Yeah. So Myers-Briggs took Jung's idea of, this comes from Psychological Types, which was written in 1923. And they took that idea and adapted it into basically a personality profiling tool for the corporate sector. And it became ubiquitous, really. And you would find they had labels like I, N, F, and J, and you'd go through, and what you'd end up finding is that if you did all the questionnaire and filled it all in, that you would find that you would, like a diamond shape would appear, maybe like that, which would be your profile. And what that would mean is that you are mostly intuitive with equal amount of thinking and feeling and a little bit more sensing. So that's how the Myers-Briggs things kind of worked. But anyway, what we've got in our culture, if you look at this, let's work with this model for a bit. All models are fatally flawed, but let's just, as a jumping off point. Our culture seems to be, in our heads, it seems to be a rational, thought, intellectual-based culture, as does our education system. So what we've got is we've got a huge emphasis on, in Jung's terms, the thinking faculty. So whenever we're presented with a problem, we tend to try and think our way out of it. And we've designed a whole education system based around thinking, around rationality. And what Jung is saying is that, in the context of being a whole person, that it's important, you need all the faculties to be present. So this is important. We're not talking about ditching rationalism or logic or thinking, because they're incredibly helpful. But what we are talking about is trying to find a bit more of a balance culturally with those other faculties. And you think in education, how much of your school education, for example, was an exploration of your feelings? Where were you asked what your intuition was about a particular thing? How much time did you spend working with your senses in a really kind of direct way? And there's bits of it, of course, but you get the drift. There's this big dominance. Um, the other thing is that a lot of human psychology is a response to fear. So we're often, primary instinct is to be safe, to make ourselves secure in lots of different ways. And what we found is that this thinking thing at some point, and this is a massive, massive conversation, but at some point in trying to survive, in basically trying to survive and keep our children alive and so on, we started to realise that that thinking was a very good tool. And we've obviously over the last particularly 400 years, there's been this incredible explosion in technologies and innovation and so on that have come through this faculty. So it's very powerful. But we've come to think of it as the only safe way of doing anything. It's the only way to feel safe is to think our way through it. And the other things have been cut off, and in lots of ways disconnected. And now often we even project all the stuff we can't deal with in our world onto these other things. So these other faculties actually get demonized. So it's the classic thing about the rational man and the feeling woman. I mean, they've been gendered as well. They get these ideas that these things are actually embodied in different genders, which is really interesting. So you get oh no, come on, everybody sit down, calm down. We need to have a rational conversation about this. We can't have an irrational conversation about it because that's ridiculous. We could have a trans-rational conversation. So these other things have been cut off. So obviously you can see where this is going. If we're going to challenge that system that's kind of stuck in that thinking world, then it's important to try and educate the whole person, to bring all the faculties together and to have educational processes that engage everything. So where we've approached sustainability or education for sustainability is we've approached it as another subject. So we learn about nature, we learn about ecosystems, and we stand here separate from nature and we learn about it. And really for me the big shift is, well, as David Orr said, knowledge alone is not enough in the context of education sustainability. What I think we need is a shift from learning about nature. We do need to learn about nature, but we need to have a shift from learning about nature to experiencing ourselves as nature. Right? So that's factoring ourselves back into nature. So we're no longer separate from it or superior to it. We're part of it. We are nature. And really you can't get a handle on that intellectually. You can only get a handle on. I can help now with that. So if you all just take a really good full breath, and when you get right to the top of that breath, just quietly in your own way, don't have to be embarrassed. When you get to the top of that breath, just hold it there, okay? And I'm going to ask you to hold it for 30 minutes. Right. So you just experienced yourself as part of nature. It's extraordinarily simple, really, isn't it? So there's this shift, a move to experiencing ourselves as part of nature, combined with honouring this powerful thinking function, and I think that's really important. To experience, this word experience is really important. If this education is about experience, then it has to be mediated through the senses. We have to have a physical, bodily experience of ourselves as part of nature. We have to have a concept of ourselves as part of nature, as part of a massive relational web. Not these individual little actors that go around interacting with other people on this stage set of the environment. We're in it, we're of it, we are it. So a good example of a relational self is you ever watched a river and you see a wave in a river. And if you watch the wave, there's a wave. You can see it. You could take a photograph of it. You could draw it. You could film it. There is a wave. You could point to it and say, there's a wave. Right? It's a thing. It's an object. It exists in the world. But the wave, of course, is actually a flow of water. And the shape of the wave is a response to the environment that the wave moves through. It's an interaction between the boulder that's forcing the water up and the banks of the river that's squeezing the water in and giving it the energy to rise, and the angle of the river, which is providing that gravity, and with friction of the air, when the wind blows, you might get some spray on top of the wave. Okay, it's a thing like we are. We exist. I'm here. I'm Dave, and I can feel myself here, but at the same time, it's the product of a massive set of relationships. And the way you test it is if you've got a bucket and scoop the wave out and set it on the side of the river to get the wave, what would happen to the wave? It's gone, no longer exists, because it's just a product of its relationships. So, yeah? So what I'm talking about here is we've kind of slipped a little bit there into this idea of, it's eco-psychology, the fundamental question of what is me? And is it the classic skin-bound ego, which is the root of Western psychology, or is it much more complicated than that? As Gregory Bateson said, you see the blind man walking down the street with his stick, tapping. In sensory terms, where does he end and where does the world begin? Is it in the skin of his hand, which of course is permeable, or is it at the end of the stick? So there's this question, this thing about relationality that's really important. And this self, understanding the self as ecological. And this experience of ecological self, as we touched on, is through experience, through the physical body. And the body is a gateway to change, I think. It leads to this experience or this way of being that is embodied. So how many of you heard that term in education about embodied learning? How does it go from learning about something to being me, And I am nature, so when I drop this piece of glass into the general waste bin, what am I doing to myself when that happens? There's this, it's a different perspective to thinking I should recycle, which requires a separation, a moral separation. And so the thing about this embodied change, I want just for a second go on a little bit of a tangent. Education, of course, is about change. And one of the things that I find very interesting and central to my work, my practice, is about changes through our life. So that's sometimes referred to as rites of passage. So these movements between different stages of life. And there's lots of ideas about them and from lots of different cultures. One of them is that we move from childhood to adolescence, and we move from adolescence to adulthood, and we move from adulthood to elderhood. That's a very classic kind of model. And at each point along this journey, there needs to be some kind of rite, some kind of conscious process of stepping through into the next phase of life. And there's a lot been written about how our culture is the product of having lost those rites, and how those rites and the deep psychological processes that they honour, how those then get pushed into the shadow, really, and they emerge as me as a 17-year-old stealing cars or taking massive risks with my own life because I'm trying to find that edge, that boundary. I'm trying to move through a stage of life. But what's really interesting about that, because it's been around for maybe 150,000 years, these processes of rights, because it has such a big archetypal charge to it, it feels to me that it's intrinsically human. It's an intrinsically human part of the change process, is that we need to honour our stages of change, our processes of change, and possibly education for sustainability could be more about that, about honouring those stages of change. But what I want to say about that is, a friend of mine did a load of research, because whenever you talk about rites of passage, folks usually see an image of the Native American vision quest or something like that. You immediately get some kind of cultural overlay to this idea of rites of passage, or it's Aboriginal bloodletting into the sand, or it's something like that. And he thought, well, what's happened here in Western Europe? What are our rights within Western Europe? And he went off and looked at things like Christian mysticism and a little bit at Sufism and alchemy. these old medieval traditions, which were all about, making gold from base metals, but actually what it was about, really, as a psychological process, was about moving from one form to another. And how do you do that? And he did it. I went to a talk he did. There's a guy called Roger Duncan, just so you know. He did this talk, and he used imagery to describe all these different symbols and processes and so on. But he said one thing at the end that just hit me, bang, and I suddenly understood a lot about my work, which is interesting. I've been doing it for 20 years, and I didn't really know what was going on. But he said something that was really important. The body is the gateway to change. That whenever all these processes involve some kind of physical activity that pushes the body out of its normal range of experience. And it can be really extreme, like bloodletting, cutting, stuff like that. Often it includes endurance. One tradition, one Inuit tradition is based on young men spending 30 days alone in an igloo out on the ice floe, and you can't stand up in this igloo, and you're not allowed out of it. You stay in there, and you brought occasional food and so on, but you sit in that little igloo for 30 days. And you imagine the hardship and the endurance of doing that. But when these young men come out, they're ready to participate in their community. So it sounds a bit scary, this idea, but what I realise is that one of the things that's central to the work that I do is that people go out on a solo, and they spend a minimum from dawn till dusk alone, or without human company anyway, in a really wild place, in a place where you have a really strong sense that you're only a little tiny, small part of a much bigger system, physical system. And that requires being cold and sometimes being hungry, and it requires being a bit scared because you wouldn't have done it before. It requires you asking, can I cope with this? Can I cope with being alone? When was the last time you were alone, completely alone for a whole day? It's like, it's amazing. A lot of the adults I work with find that phenomenally moving. They come back and they're like, I've never done that. Not since I was a child. And that comes up. So this idea of the body as being important, physicality being important, and I guess the point I'm trying to make is that I found it much easier to educate for sustainability by engaging physically with the body, and with also, of course, with natural environments. You can do it right here in the middle of London, but it's actually easier to get started with the process in an environment where it's very, very easy to feel that you're part of that environment, because you have to get your water from the stream. And if you need to go to the toilet, you have to really think about what you're going to do and how it works and what the impacts are and everything. So that's why people often say to me, why? What about people in urban environments? Why do you have to work outdoors? And my answer to that really is, you don't. It's just easier. It's an easier way of getting started into it. So this thing about the body is really important. Sitting in a classroom, you can't learn to drive a car by sitting in a room reading the manual. You have to engage your whole body, your whole felt sense and everything.
Great.
So, So we made a little slip there into thinking about education as change in a much more generic sense. And there's a few other little points here, maybe not related so much to the last bit, but came up in the first question. I think when people say to me education, I always used to have a picture of young people, children, young people in a school, or perhaps on a field trip or something, but it was about young people. And my work is, I've worked with 14 to 18-year-olds, but for the last 15 years at least, I've only worked with adults. And I remember having quite a clear reason for that. I'm not sure how long ago it was, but I remember sort of becoming very, very fearful about the state of the planet and doing a lot of work with that fear, which was quite hard. And one of the things I realised was that the whole question was largely an issue of timing. The planet will go on, but there's a question of when things will happen and how they will happen, and whether we get to be part of that community, or of the human community, which parts of it get to survive as the Earth adapts to this changing system, which is quite hard to think about. But one of the things I thought was, there isn't time to wait for these kids to grow up. There isn't time, you know. So I thought, and the other thing, of course, is there's a huge amount of energy going into educating young people. And there's amazing initiatives around education for sustainability for young people. Adults? How many of you here know an education for sustainability project for middle-aged white men? Yeah, okay. Yeah, good call. Yes, that's another conversation. Anyway, so that's a little bit of a risky statement, of course, but you could argue that there are the groups of people that have the most influence over how the planning, what happens in our human cultures, are middle-aged white men, you know, which is a scary prospect. And so surely they're the ones that need the education. So there's all this thinking about, first of all, we need to work with adults because there isn't time to wait for all the kids to, my daughter who's just about to turn 9, her awareness of stuff that she's got from school is fantastic. You know, she pulls us up on stuff all the time. Where did we buy our energy, Dad? So, I'm sure you've experienced that. So there's a whole generation there, I think, that really are thinking about it. It is central to a lot of their understanding of the world. But my peers, a huge spectrum. So this is a point about educating. It's a call for educating with adults, design programs for adults, work with adults, and also work with people in positions of power. Go out and be ruthless and get to those particular people and try and help them experience themselves as part of nature, so that they can then do something to act out that experience. So just a little point, really. The another thing David Orr said, which I think is really important, is that the context for education is more important than the content. So imagine if we'd done this session in the park, I would have felt completely different. I would have felt completely different, so I would have probably delivered it a completely different way. You would have definitely felt completely different. Maybe not as comfortable, but it would have been different. So that's very important for me. I found even if I've had to, I got asked to do this kind of quite formal lecture for the Peninsula Medical School about ecopsychology, which was really formidable for me to do that in that world. So I asked if I could do it on the beach. So we went sat on the beach and did it. It was great, partly because I felt comfortable doing it. So this thing about context is really important, to really think hard about where the learning takes place, because often the place you're in will help a massive amount. It will contribute. It will be part of the process, and to trust that the place will help. That's another big thing. Yeah, and I guess the final point really is, we've alluded to it earlier by delving into a bit of psychology, about this idea of a wholeness. And the word healing is derived from the word wholeness. And it feels to me like with education for sustainability, not necessarily other forms of education, but particularly with that, because it's about coming into relationship with everything, which is a process of becoming whole, that the boundaries between what education is and what healing is start to get really blurred. And so the skills we need as educators might be that we need to understand the psychology of that. We need to understand what this relational self is, and how it might work, and how we can work with it. So there's this idea of a guy that James will know from Centre for Human Ecology, Alistair McIntosh, who talks about we need a cultural psychotherapy. And I really like that idea. I find that very helpful. It's a bit scary, particularly if you work in education and you're not a psychologist. You think, well, whoa, that's massive. But of course, it's not such a big deal once you start to get into it. But just to get across this idea of, therapy is a very difficult word, but because it always implies that somebody needs to be brought up to some kind of normal state, when in fact most of us we're okay. But I think that's a very important thing to think about this healing relationships at every level is a fundamentally important part of it. So an education for sustainability might be contained in the way you treat the person you buy a drink from on the way home tonight, the way you interact with that person, the quality of relationship you embody in that interaction might be the ultimate form of activism when it comes to education sustainability, especially if you then apply that through all the relationship. Yeah, there's a last thing here. I've just written at the bottom, get out more.
Right. Okay.
That would be me. Thank you.
Who wants to start? Like the lady here?
Sorry, I was looking about embodiment education. I'm wondering if this relates on psychology and the recommend start sending.
Oh, the embodiment.
Well, I mean, no, you talk a lot about, embodied education, but I'd like to read a book on
Yeah, it's a good question. Gosh, yeah, there's stuff written in lots of different areas about that kind of thing, but I mean, the classic text from Psychology, which does touch on this a lot, I think, is the book written in 1995, it was edited in 1995 by Theodore Rosa, called Psychology, and that's a very good kind of inroad. It's quite American, it kind of emerged out of transpersonal psychology, really, which is the psychology that acknowledges that we have that there's something greater than ourselves, and that's traditionally been interpreted as being a spiritual thing. But what ecopsychology does is it puts the physical environment into that mix. So that's quite a good start. But the best thing to do actually is to email me, and I can send you reams of stuff. Yeah, there's I can send you a reading list that we developed for natural change to evidence that approach, and that's got loads of good stuff in it. So yeah, do that. Anybody, if you want to do that, if you have a question afterwards, just let me know and I can respond.
I was just thinking about your talk about engaging people with power, and I was wondering, do you think different groups are more adaptable to change? The reason I ask is when I look at primates, in patriarchal primate groups, old males who had high status are least likely to adapt to new change. They won't, for example, the classic being self-imitated himself.
Yeah.
Whereas even high status old females are more likely to change.
Yeah.
So do you think that different groups are harder to induce
Yeah.
change in or not? I was just wondering if it's engaging with power people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting about Natural Change, that project, is that I've worked all my life with people that have self-selected to come on my courses, who tend to be, interested in sustainability, of course, particularly in facilitating change. But with that project, people were targeted and invited to come along, and some of them were actually really resistant. They actually saw the sustainability agenda being in opposition to social justice, which is a very, common perspective. They didn't see how they were linked together, really. So there was quite a lot of kind of leftist battle crying in the face of environmentalism, which was interesting. But, so they're quite a hard group. Some of them are quite hard people to change. But because they're quite hard people to change, I mean, you can't take them into a room like this with a flip chart and engage with someone like that. But if you take them on a boat for half an hour to the remotest part of the British Isles, and where there's no mobile phone reception, and the lights turn off at 11 because there's no electricity, and they spend an entire day on their own, it doesn't really matter who they rage at, or there are powers present that are much greater than anything they can imagine or anything they could debate or discuss, and that seems to have this immense levelling process. The other thing, of course, is that it makes people feel vulnerable. And what vulnerability can do is, if it's abused, it can lead to abuse. It can be really negative. But if vulnerability is held really beautifully well, it leads to intimacy. It leads to an opening up. And a lot of stuff comes up for people, personal stuff comes up for people through that process. And what we try and do is we don't have an agenda. We start the project with we say that no change is expected from anybody. And it comes from Gestalt therapy, where there's this idea that if you don't expect change, that's the best environment for change to happen. So we try not to have a change agenda at all. We just say, we're just going to go out there as a group, and we're going to do this stuff, and we're going to see what happens. And if you go back to your job at the end of it and nothing changes, that's completely cool with us. then they can ditch the guilt as well, which is helpful. So my point really is that if you provide one of these right type experiences, RITE, one of these experiences that really draws us into our physical selves, that helps us experience primal emotions like elation, ecstasy when the sun comes out after a rainstorm, or fear of the dark wood behind me, or whatever it is. If you can work at that level, that a lot of these resistances start to dissipate, and especially when it's clear that no one's got an agenda, a change agenda, it then just becomes a journey. And what we found is that seems to naturally lead to to very trusting relationships within the group and with the facilitators. And that holding environment and the experiences of wider nature often just dissolve that resistance. So, yeah, a huge amount of difference in how easily people will change. But for me, the way to approach that is by providing experiences that are beyond their everyday experience, to push the boundaries of what's normal, what's familiar.
Hi.
Hi.
I was interested in the last thing you said about how, the way you buy a beer off someone and after you leave or something is, the most important thing about maybe the way you create change. And I did a master's in education for sustainability, and at the beginning of the master's I started thinking that being sustainable was the best way to spread sustainability, and by the end of 3, 4, 5 years of studying I decided that being sustainable was the best way to spread sustainability. Now obviously as educators, the individual's kind of sense of themselves and being in the world is very important in communicating this stuff, but it's actually very difficult for people in our urban context in schools to carry that under pressure and etc. Can you tell us anything about how we might work with ourselves to be more grounded in terms of the way we deliver education in different ways as beings?
Yeah, again, I'll use natural change as a case study for that. One of the things that was really important in that process wasn't that people just came and did this program and went away again. There were two aspects to it. One was that the support from the group, I'll stand up so I can see, the support from the group continued after the project, and actually the first group that ever did it are still all in touch with each other, which is phenomenal, I think, after 5 years. And they still meet up, and so this developing a supportive community is fundamentally important to give that nourishment, to give that strength and courage, and to sustain people when they go back into that world. And the other thing is that we realised that what we were doing really was helping people develop a practice, which was once you've been out and done a solo for a day, you could go off and do that again another time. You certainly learn how to do it and how to feel safe and comfortable taking yourself off to do that kind of practice. But what we also find is that people will, in their lunch break in the middle of Edinburgh, they'll go out to Princes Street Gardens and find their tree and have their sandwich under that, and they'll just sit there for a bit and feel their tree and the ground, and that's like a wormhole back to their solo spot, or when they were last out in that really wild place, and it becomes much easier to tap into that experience of being this little tiny part of this huge relational web. So we found that this development of a practice is really important, and Gary Schneider described it beautifully as a practice of the wild. So it can be quite a physical practice, which is simply finding whatever it is that gives you that centre, whether it be community or experiences outdoors or both or whatever. But the other thing is also this thing about wildness. And people experience wildness, which is not a place, it's a quality. And you can experience it on Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow on a Friday night. Wild, right? Proper wild. So this idea of wildness I think is very important, and it turns into that thing that Thoreau talked about, this kind of idea of civil disobedience, this idea of perhaps in a very urban environment where you're expected to behave in a certain way, of compassionately not behaving in that way. You're exercising your wildness, I am not going to stand in this queue. I'll go and have a cup of coffee. I'll find somewhere else to, and that kind of slightly edgy response, I think, is also a way of people keeping hold on their experience of wildness when they're out in a wild place. So there's lots of different bits and pieces to it. The relational quality, i.e. thinking, how do I interact with this next person? this idea of wildness, which I find really helpful when I'm in a kind of big urban environment, just the refusing to take part thing, and these other things which feel like touchstones to providing something to go back to. So yeah, there's other stuff, but yeah.
Do you think it's prohibitive in education programs if they have like very specific aims? If you're trying not to expect any kind of change, do you think it's better to kind of let it be a bit more fluid and free?
Well, I suppose it depends on what you're trying to do, because like if you're trying to educate people about something specific, I don't know what that might be, but you know, you do need an outcome. We had a very funny event happen at WWF. Was that the first project got commissioned because the director was away on sabbatical, and the woman who the communications manager woman had talked about, her friend was standing in for it. So that's how we managed to get the funding, because WWF don't do culture or psychology. They definitely don't do psychology. They do science and policy. So of course he came back from a sabbatical and he went and had a look at what was there, and he wanted to know, whoa, who wrote that check, you know, and who are these people? So we got called to a meeting, and in that meeting we sat around the table, and he said, so what are the outcomes of this program going to be? And I said, I have no idea. The blood drained from his face, because he was answerable, you know, he's accountable for this money. And I said, but we will know afterwards, you know, once we've done it, we'll know. So at one level, there's this thing about, and the work I do is very much like that. It's very process focused. It's that we're going in there without expectation of change. We're working with these very big experiential processes. We're trying to engage people's intuition, feelings, and senses. And they get a chance to do the thinking bit when they're having their dinner with each other. They have a bit of a so we're very much working in that way. We're trying to get people to a very big level, really, to not level really, but we're trying to get them to change the way they understand themselves in the world. So it's quite a big thing. So that's an outcome, really, isn't it? But when it's more specific, like you're trying to help people understand climate change or understand why we need to recycle stuff or whatever it is, then of course you're going to go in there with an outcome from that. So I think it's really important. What this comes down to ultimately, I think, is your intent as a facilitator. What's in your heart? What are you going into that session to do? What's your aim there? I think is actually more significant than the outcomes. Outcomes are things we need to put on funding application forms. And as soon as we're finished putting the outcomes on there, we can just forget about them. That's my opinion, anyway, for what it's worth. They're very good at, you know, obviously funders need to know what the outcomes are going to be, so we usually make up a load, to be honest. Yeah.
I was kind of interested when you said about the body being like the gateway to change, and also like experiencing things kind of through yourself and your body. And I think there's probably a lot of us here from kind of fashion and textile backgrounds, and most of the time we're all wearing clothes. So are there examples you can think of where can clothes be a tool to also kind of help with that interface between our bodies and nature?
Well, it's funny you should say that, actually.
Make change.
Yeah, I mean, we've had some really interesting experiences with that, actually. There's one woman who described she said, my concept of the wilderness was the gap between the door of the taxi and Harvey Nicks. I thought that was beautiful. And that was before she started. And, you know, I'm sure she'll mind me telling you, one of her significant fears was wearing fleece. She said, if my friends knew that I'd been wearing fleece, so I would never live it down. And another thing that happened, and this is beautiful actually, she wears heels a lot for work particularly. She's like a very kind of high-powered political character, and she power dresses, you know. She wore heels, and after the actual change, she got into walking, and she had walking boots to go walking, and after a while, she found that her tendons got really, really sore from walking in walking boots. And it was a huge process around this, because suddenly she was asking the question, well, why did I wear the heels? And all this stuff came up about the relationship between the clothes, the power, her identity, the feeling of sorrow and loss as she started to experience pain just walking on a flat surface, you know. it was really, really big deal for her. And another thing that's come up is people who've described their clothing and the way they have to dress for certain environments, and people describing their clothes as armour, and this whole relationship between protecting ourselves in environments which we feel are hostile, or where we feel we're going to be challenged. And then also reflecting on Gore-Tex jackets as armour against the rain, and this whole thing, which has got a huge psychological foundation, this idea of, there is actually a whole thing about body armouring, which comes from Wilhelm Reich, who's kind of one of the first body therapists. So there's a lot. The other thing that's very interesting that links into fashion quite strongly is the whole relationship to food and eating disorders. And there's a whole range of stuff that's come out in our work around that. So ideas of self-esteem and self, and so on. So yeah, food, clothing, fashion, cultural constructs of what's powerful and what's not, all the way through.
Sorry, no,
I wondered if a lot of the things you've been saying keep making me think about, kept making me think of the common cause.
Oh yes, yeah.
And I wondered just this idea of kind of like becoming personally engaged with an issue rather than just seeing it as separate from. I just wondered if there's any link, or if you'd ever kind of worked with those people involved. Because I know the guy,
Tom.
there was a guy from WWF who was really involved in it. Yeah, so I just wondered if you could sort of.
So we were all out in the woods, and Tom's down home writing his common cause thing, and then we didn't know each other. It was really interesting. And then as the project went on, we started to circle in, and eventually we met up down in Cornwall. Actually, went out for a big walk, which was really good fun, and had this massive conversation, and then started to share ideas and stuff. And he references natural change quite a few times as a values-based approach to change. But actually, I think it's not so much a values-based approach, it's an identity-based approach. And my feeling is that identity kind of trumps values. I think that the values often emerge as a response to our environment, to the situation we're in. There's a lot of evidence in psychology for that. We do classic woman, we tend to behave like everyone else in the room. So we'll adapt, we'll shift our value set to fit the context we're in. And that's largely about feeling safe. So values are, for me, is the circumplex they have like a circle with all these different values, and like altruism and individualism and stuff, and they're all set kind of opposite each other and seem to be opposites or opposing values. There's quite a lot of argument about that even values that we don't think of as like we'd see altruism as being good and being something that would lead to sustainable action. We see individualism as bad and something that wouldn't lead to that. So you get this polemic. But actually there's quite a lot of people who, even acting in their own very individual best interests, might make decisions that actually are very environmentally sustainable. So then there's not always a clear relationship. So that's the one thing, the movable feast factor, and the fact that different values don't always lead to different behaviours in a hard set way. So Tom's always, when the conversation's kind of gone, but identity trumps values, and values is a movable feast, and he's gone, but where's the evidence for that? So it's a tricky one. Yeah.
Okay, just the last question.
Is there anything that you recommend we can do in an everyday context to open people up, or do you think it's necessary to have this big experiential process?
Yeah, well, that's great. I mean, though, it's like the thing I said before, it's easier to do it that way. But I think there are ways. One of the things I like is about being unconventional, so challenging the normal way of doing things. A good medium for that is time, our relationship to time, and our relationship to technology. That's a good one, right? We're going to gather, instead of having a 1 hour meeting, we're going to spend the whole day. And we're not going to take phones or laptops or anything like tablets with us or anything. We're not going to take any paper. We're going to go for a walk. And you immediately change it. I mean, our constructs around time are absolutely massive. So the second natural change project, we had a guy you said this is 16 days of contact time over the next six months. You know, I'm like the senior whatever in this massive whatever. Where am I going to get 16 days in the next 6 months? And we said, well, one of the points of the project is to change our culture. And one part of our culture we want to change is our attitude to time. And the question really is, if you're not going to do it now, when are you going to do it? So, which is quite interesting, and he can. So, I think there's things like that I think that can be quite helpful. And I think there are lots of practices out there that just shift us into a slightly different. It's about changing your state of consciousness, I think, into something a little bit different. And really, it's limited only by our imaginations as to how we might do that. But it's just about not doing things the way they're always done. That immediately creates a conversation, immediately creates a dialogue about what's normal and what's not, what's cultural and what's countercultural. So,
There is a lot of questions, but still, we need to finish in one point because we need to leave here. So, I mean, a couple of things. You are happy to be in contact with the people here,
yeah,
of course. Yeah. Second, we just David talked a lot about the context and the environment. So I wonder how this discussion could be, the same discussion in the pub. I think that we will find other angles to explore it. So everyone is welcome to go to the pub. We go here to the Angelic. It's in front of the Angel station. Just carry on, and we carry on the discussion, those of you who can come. And it's a nice way to approach these issues from another more relaxed or less formal attitude. And the last, I will just ask a question. You didn't finish the story. You told the story. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, that's
so, like, what happened with the gentleman?
well, I don't know.
Oh, okay.
It's an open question. What I guess what I'm getting at
Okay.
is the power of one significant, out of the ordinary experience of, I guess, of immense beauty and grace, and how the power that can have to change something massive in a couple of hours. That was the point, really. Is that as educators, we need to find those kinds of experiences, I think.
Or alternatively, you might have found it not actually financially viable.
Yeah. No.
Could I just say one tiny thing, just something that I wanted to share is that over the course of the session, I work at Stepney City Farm, working with kids mainly, but something that the farm does is corporate volunteers come every so often. I don't get involved with it, but I have to cover next week. And something that I've been inspired to do is when I'm working with these bankers during the day, I think I'm going to ask them to take their lunch and find a sit spot, kind of inspired from that culture of the sit space, just to sit for half an hour and then to come back and at the end of the day find out how that went. And that's something that I feel like directly inspired to do from how it comes to this. So that might be because I never engaged with them, but this might be one way to.
Yeah, brilliant.
And we have one day out of the classroom are organizing. It's not Anna here? No. Okay. Hello.
Chris has been
Okay, Chris, yeah.
Everybody, what the idea is.
Yeah, of course. Empty classroom day, which not only something you may have seen emails and stuff about. And I actually think it's really nicely with this, about the whole creating an experience for somebody. And engaging someone's whole body, their whole being, getting them outside the learning environment. And well, kids obviously that's what we're aiming at, classrooms. But their teachers as well. Everyone's getting outside of the learning environment. They're going to a range of places, they're going to some organisations, some going to the woods, like beaches, farms, and they're experiencing things outside. Really good. Came with some really nice ideas from this actually. Yeah, I mean check it out on like Project Dirt. Really nice. It's in 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you.